somebody's prepared.
I think some of us are always prepared.
And you know, and some of us aren't.
Some of us are always prepared, Chris. I'm going to let you preach today.
Yeah.
I can preach today. I can absolutely preach today.
Some of us just wing it.
That's, well, no, but that's something I learned, you know, I actually, and he's way smarter and a way better evangelist and everything else than I would ever be, but Ed Harrell taught me that. Because he came some Sunday morning, he was just coming into town, and Dave Barnes, who was really good friends with him, said, hey, you want to preach? I said, sure. And he got up and preached the lesson, it was awesome, and I mean, but that's, no, not everybody has, so two things, not everybody has that skill set, and I'm gonna argue also that when you're in perpetual study, like you, when you, remember, at this point, he's 60 years old.
Yeah.
At 60 years old, it's a much different gig than that, so full-time preacher, an educator, you know, all these different things played in. But what it did was it triggered me that said, you know what, I always want to be prepared if I need to be.
That is one of the advantages of being a peon preacher, that when I show up on some place for vacation,
Right.
no one's asking me to preach. Joey Warrior walks in, it's like, Joey, you want to have
Yeah,
it?
right,
That girl
right,
walks in,
yeah,
it's like,
yeah.
you want to preach?
Yeah.
That's not gonna happen. I'm just saying from experience. Be prepared.
I think so.
I have friends and guys who are a little farther along that actually have an outline in their Bible.
I'm just telling you.
And I am not one of these. My grandfather, the church I grew up attending, the third Sunday night every month, man of the congregation preached. And we had a tradition there 5 minutes before worship. So I would go up and say, ask the preacher, what's the main text today? And we'd write it on the chalkboard because we were old school. That actually takes me out. And today's scripture reading is Mark 16, 8 through 16. And we would read it. They sit down next to my grandfather and Mr. Paul. What's the text for today's sermon? And he goes, I'm not preaching, go ask her. He's like, no, Brother Paul, you're preaching. And he gave him a verse and preached from it, and you wouldn't know it.
But it is, to Terry's point, it is part of it's study, it's skill set, it's age, it's time behind the line, it's, you know, it's a whole bunch of different things.
It all plays into it.
It's
It all plays
into
into it.
it, yeah.
So we are going to go ahead and get rolling in 2 Kings chapter 13. 2 Kings chapter 13. And for the handful of people who have gotten the material ahead of time, some of the teachers, and looked over it, I actually, and know this, I actually struggled a lot with this class on what text to use to talk about God being forgiving. Because there's so many texts that you can go to look at God's forgiveness and how God is always willing to forgive. I thought about going to one of the minor prophets just to give us a taste of how God is always reaching out and forgiving his people, like looking at Hosea or Jonah or Joel or just any one of the minor prophets. That's pretty much the message. It's, I want to forgive you. I don't want to judge you. You just come back to me. I will. And then late in the week, when I say late in the week, I mean like Friday, it hit me that we're going to look at 2 Kings 13. 2 Kings 13 will be our main text today. And just kind of remind ourselves of what we're looking at in our study this quarter or this 6-week term that we are in the middle of going through. We are basing our study out of Exodus 34, 6 and 7, that key text that we've kind of kept in the back of our mind that we are going to kick our class off today with Exodus 34 verses 6 and 7, where Moses writes there in the text, the Lord passed in front of him, that's Moses, and proclaimed, the Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children and the grandchildren to the third and the fourth generation. And we've spent the last few weeks, last 4 or 5 weeks, looking at some of these characteristics of God. We looked at God being compassionate and gracious, God being full of faithful love, God being slow to anger, and today we are going to focus on God being forgiving. Starting here, basing here in 2 Kings chapter 13. By just kind of set the story up for 2 Kings, because I realize it may not be a book that we look at a lot. Some of us really like history. Some of us, when we were in school and it got around to history class, we were just like, get us through. And 2 Kings I like 2 Kings. I like the book, the historical books. But so here's what's kind of going on, just to kind of familiarize ourselves with the context. That as you move through 1st and 2nd Kings, one thing is really becoming clear. God's people can't help themselves. They are always sinning, they are always failing, they are always falling short. And each and every king, especially in the northern kingdom, because as you remember, the kingdom divides after the death of Solomon. The northern king has southern kingdom has a couple of good kings, but the northern kingdom, they're all bad, and they get progressively worse. And so here's how I kind of remember which is which. In the Civil War in America, which was the good side? If you're from Tennessee, like I am, you say the South because it's home. But the people, one fighting for freedom and everything, that was the North. Okay, that's who won. The northern kingdom was the good ones. Actually, I just got that backwards. So just disregard that. It's the exact opposite of the Civil War. Anyways, northern king bad, southern king good, more or less. And each of the northern kings especially takes them farther and farther and farther away into sin. They keep drifting further and further away to God. And if we were to read like the story of the divided kingdom, one of the questions I think we would be asking is like, how long can this go on? Like, how long is God going to put up with this madness? How long is God going to put up with their sin? Because they are doing some really, really, really sinful, bad, evil stuff. And that's why if we were to kind of read and get to 2 Kings 13, 2 Kings 13 would be kind of shocking to us. Because Israel hasn't earned another chance. But in the middle of their sins and their failures, we see that God is still forgiving them, that he wants to have a relationship with them. And so I want to ask this question that kind of kick off our class, and I may have spoiled it a little bit already, but what repeated spiritual problems do we see in 2 Kings 1, 2 Kings 11, and 2 Kings 13 in those verses? What repeated spiritual problem do we see?
Spiritual issue is that they're not worshiping God, they're worshiping Baal and Ashtaroth. They adulterize
Yeah.
themselves.
Baal, Asherah, Molech, Chemosh, and I think there are hints throughout the story that it's not just Baal and Asherah and Chemosh and Molech, that they may also be worshiping God too. So it's like this weird synchronized, if I can use that term, religion where they're doing God in the idols of this world. That they see God, Yahweh is just another God in the pantheon of gods to be worshipped. So that's, one of them is idolatry is a huge problem. Yeah, Craig.
Going with what you just said, that even if they did acknowledge God, they weren't putting him first.
Yeah.
They were going to these other gods first.
And I'm glad you said that, Craig, because God is not just another God in a pantheon of gods. Like, he's not Zeus next to Apollos and all the Greek mythological gods that we learned about in school. Like, God is actually God. He's the one who spoke and created the world. And so he wants to, and he deserves to be treated as such, as the God, as the king of this world. And yet, Israel isn't quite ready to do that. They don't worship God with their whole heart all the time. And that really summarizes the northern and southern kingdom at the same time. What are the repeated spiritual problems that they have? So idolatry is one. That idolatry, I think, leads to other sins that we may talk about as we're working through, especially when we get to Asherah. It's going to be a mention of Asherah, I think, in verse 6. So idolatry, sin. What other, any other spiritual problems that you guys saw there in those verses? To be honest, I think those are the big ones. And
Well,
so,
but I mean, so first of all, these guys are supposed to be in a covenant relationship
Yeah.
with God, and so they're rejecting that. And so all of the different constructs that he put in place that we've been studying throughout Exodus and the Numbers and Deuteronomy, all of those things are being ignored. The things that Kevin's talked about with this every 7 years and the year of Jubilee and all that,
Yeah.
well, it's just has
Yeah.
been cast away. So the entire construct of what God had put together for his chosen people is being ignored acutely in the north and in the south as well, just not as egregious at this particular point, although headed that way.
I'm glad you connected it, Chris, with some of the other parts of the law, like the 7-year rest and other stuff. They are just completely and totally, as we would read if we were to read the entire book, just kind of ignored. Like, they are not living up to the covenant that they had made with God. In fact, listen to the way Jehoahaz, that's the king that we're going to be looking at today. His reign is described starting there in verse 1. That in the 23rd year of Judah's king Joash, son of Ahaziah, Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, I am so glad we name our kids easier to pronounce names today, became king over Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 17 years. So this is actually starting around or taking place around 814 or so BC. So to kind of set the context historically, Israel has about 100 more years before they go off into exile. So 100 more years of madness. Israel goes into exile. The northern kingdom goes into exile around 721 BC. And he, Jehoahaz, does what is evil in the Lord's sight, verse 2, and followed the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had caused Israel to commit. He did not turn away from them. If you go all the way back to the beginning of Jeroboam's reign, Jeroboam was the first king of the northern kingdom, so the kingdom divides when Rehoboam takes over, Solomon's son, and Jeroboam becomes the first king in the northern kingdom, and he sets up a calf there at Dan and Bethel and tells Israel, this is your God, this is where you will worship. You don't have to go down to Jerusalem to worship, this is where you can go. He sets those up, and that kind of sets the stage for the northern kingdom to go further and further into idolatry.
Hey,
Yeah.
Austin, so Jeroboam's interesting to me because Jeroboam he's the one who God gave him, said, you can have it all. It can all be yours. I'm gonna go with you. And he rejected God at that level.
Yeah, he rejected it, and there's an interesting thing. If we were to go back to 1 Kings, I think it's 1 Kings 12 and 13 or so, when this is all kind of going down, there's a lot we can learn from some of Jeroboam's mistakes. Like, he sets up these idols of convenience. He sets up these idols because he's worried that if people will go back to Jerusalem, that he'll lose all power. Forgetting exactly what Chris has said about God, what God told Jeroboam, that, look, if you're faithful to me, you'll be blessed. You're going to have it all. And he's still worried. Doesn't entirely trust God. And so he sets up those idols, which sets up a history of idolatry, particularly in the northern kingdom. And really what you look at here in the first 5 verses of chapter 13 is very similar to what we read there in the book of Judges. Have you guys ever heard of the Judges cycle? Y'all know what I'm talking about when I say Judges cycle. Like, Israel sins, so God punishes them. So they cry out to God, so God sends a deliverer. That's really, it divides up differently depending on who they are, but that's really the basic gist of it. That's what we see here in Jehoahaz's story. that he sends, verse 2. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Todd's going to talk about the judgment of the Lord and the Lord being just next week. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he handed them over to King Hazael of Aram, or does anybody's Bible say Syria there? That is Syria with an S, not Assyria with an A. And to his son Ben-Hadad during their reigns. Then Jehoahaz sought the Lord's favor, and the Lord heard him, and he saw the oppression of the king of Aram inflicted on Israel. And so the Lord gave Israel a deliverer, and they escaped the power of the Arameans. Then the people of Israel served the Lord faithfully, because God had forgiven them. That's what my verse 5 says. No. I'm getting a couple puzzled looks. Then the people of Israel returned to their former way of life. And I kind of spoiled this question a little bit, but how does God respond to his people in 2 Kings 13? How does God respond? That he has sent a punisher to judge them, to oppress them, to bring them back, and they cry out. So what does God do for them there in verse 5? He saves them. He sends a deliverer. That's what God does throughout his history. Go back to Exodus. Exodus end of chapter 2, I believe. Israel is in Egypt. They're slaves, and they are crying out. It doesn't even say they're crying out to God in Exodus chapter 2. And God sends a deliverer and judges. People are being oppressed. They cry out to God. God sends a deliverer. And here in 2 Kings 13, even though the people are living wickedly, God sends a deliverer. God provides relief and deliverance, and I would argue maybe some level of forgiveness here in the text. That despite the fact that they are living in sin, they have not really turned their whole heart back to God. God still shows his grace. God still shows his mercy. God still shows love to his people. That they have been wicked, they have sinned, but God's grace, God's love, God's forgiveness is greater than their sin. And despite that, in verse 6, verse 5, they return to their former way of life. And what did that involve? Look at verse 6. They did not turn away from the sins that the house of Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. Jehoahaz continued in them, and the Asherah pole also remained standing in Samaria. They continued to worship idols. What do y'all know about idol worship in the ancient world? What do you know about some of these idols and these false gods that are mentioned from time to time in the Bible? What do you guys know? Prevalent. Every ancient society had their gods that they served, and they had their own pantheon of gods. If you were to walk in ancient Babylon, they would have their gods. You were watching to ancient Egypt, you would have their gods. You were walking to ancient Philistia, they would have their gods, and they all worshiped their gods in unique ways. So let's think about that. How were some of these gods of the ancient Near East worshipped? Some of the gods that are actually mentioned in the Bible, these false gods. What did they do to worship these false gods? Child sacrifices would. That they would make their kids pass through the fire. If I'm remembering, I think it's Chemosh is the one. It's either Chemosh or Molech that you would worship by sacrificing your child. That you would stick the child in the arms of the god and you would kill him. For us, looking back today, that looks horrific. But I think there's some modern applications there for us and how we view children and how we treat children today. So child sacrifice is prevalent in the ancient world. What's another way they would worship gods, their gods in the ancient world, particularly Asherah.
Is that prostitution on?
Ritual prostitution. So one of the things we are seeing here in the text is not only has Israel been unfaithful to their covenant with God by committing ritual prostitution with the false gods, by prostituting themselves to the false gods. That's what you see in some of the prophets. They'll actually use that term. They have been sinning by committing ritual prostitution and worship of their God. They believed that act of prostitution simulated or encouraged the god to send rain or to send whatever to fertilize the ground. That's just kind of a slow, very quick way of looking at it. And so Israel is doing some fairly exceedingly wicked things at this time. They are making it well known that they are not obeying their covenant that they had made with God. And those sins continue. Yes, God had delivered them. Yes, God had rescued them. Yes, God had probably forgiven them. But those sins continued under Jehoahaz. But Jehoahaz dies there in verse 9, and his son becomes king, because that's what you did. The father dies, son becomes king. In verse 11, he does what is evil in the Lord's sight. He did not turn away from all the sins that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had caused Israel to commit, but he continued in them. In fact, if we were to zoom out and look at some historical documentation, combining it with what we see here in the biblical text, one of the other sins that they committed, in addition to idolatry, in addition to breaking the covenant, in addition to the ritual prostitution that accompanied and the child sacrifice that accompanied the worship of these false gods. Tied in with all of this was they also were trusting the nations for protection rather than trusting God. There's actually some really cool stuff like that with the archaeologists, like the Indiana Joneses of the world, have dug up over the ancient Near East, and that actually talk about some of these biblical characters that we're reading about making treaties with people like Assyria for protection. That in order for Israel, in their mind, I'm putting yourselves in their mind in the ancient Near East, that we need protection. We got to overthrow the Arameans. We got to overthrow the Syrians. We're going to turn to Assyria to help us defeat and overthrow the Syrians, or the Arameans. And so there were some treaties back and forth. They were putting more trust in Assyria than they were in God, which was a violation of the covenant as well. Yeah.
Just along those lines too, but it's not in these verses, but elsewhere in Kings, and it talks about them acquiring horses and chariots and things like that. And that was God, before they entered the land, specifically said in the covenant that they should not acquire horses and chariots. And they do exactly that. So they're placing their faith in all these other things.
If you were to write down in your international relations, and go to that section of the old law, the Mosaic law, and said, here's how you should treat the international relations, approach international politics. If you were to make a list of all the laws, don't multiply chariots. Don't increase I want to modernize it just a little bit if I can. Don't increase your military budget. Okay? I'm not trying to make a political statement. I'm just trying to put it in contextual terms for us. Don't multiply your horses and chariots. Don't make treaties with the surrounding nations. Don't worship their gods. Don't marry their daughters and their sons. And if you were to look at that, Israel breaks every one of those rules regarding international politics. They are not faithful to the covenant. And yet God is patient, and God forgives. Yeah, Todd.
This kind of struck a chord with me there, but we don't know who this deliverer is or what this deliverer is. It could be weather,
Yeah.
or it could be an individual. We don't know.
Yeah.
However, what we can surmise is that there was conflict, obviously, with the Syrians or the Arameans. And although Israel was liberated from that, it cost them dearly. As we're speaking
Yeah.
about chariots, because they are left with the
Yeah.
bare minimum,
Yeah.
less than a self-defense force.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because in verse 7, tying what Kevin said a moment ago with the covenant, that they were told, don't multiply your horses, don't multiply their chariots, and yet that's exactly what they did. And yet, because they were oppressed, as part of that oppression there in verse 7, Jehoahaz didn't have an army left except for 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 foot soldiers. That's not a very, like, what was the term you used, like self-defense force?
Yeah, they've got no defense force.
Yeah, that's barely a secret service.
They are defenseless now.
They have defenseless. They have no protection. They are totally at the mercy of Aram for protection. And really, that's probably on Aram's part intentional, because if Israel has an army, what are they likely to do? They're likely to rebel. They're likely to try to overthrow the Arameans and gain their independence, or total independence again. But what we see here is they did. And Jehoahaz died. Jehoash takes over, and he dies there in verse 13. And so really, what is 2 Kings 13 showing us about the difference between God's mercy and Israel's faithfulness? What is the story teaching us about God's mercy and Israel's faithfulness?
God's mercy outweighs Israel's faithfulness.
100% all the time. And
Mercy is not really required without transgression. Mercy isn't required.
yeah, without transgression. Yeah, that's true. But what we're seeing, I think, you need to have sins for mercy to be demonstrated. But God's mercy, God's forgiveness, God's grace, whatever term you want to use there to describe what God is showing to Israel here, outweighs all of the sins. That He is out there, and He's trying, He's reaching out, He's trying to reestablish, He's trying to bring them back, He's trying to call them back. Yeah, Chris.
I think God in the Old Testament demonstrates what Jesus told Peter in the New Testament, and that is that in this complete wash of sin, that His mercy, His forgiveness is greater than that.
Yeah.
And it's a concept that Peter can't get his arms around. And it's really probably the center point of our biggest challenge when it comes to us forgiving.
Yeah. God has this incredible, tremendous power to forgive that I am not sure we completely understand, which is why I think we have the same struggle that Peter had in the Gospels to bring what Chris said. Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, what I was getting at though, like with God saying up front to Israel in Exodus that He is merciful, like what that immediately communicates to me is that, like, if you're perfect, you don't need mercy.
Yeah. Okay.
But God is saying, like, He's going into this covenant with them, knowing that they're not perfect.
Yeah, that's a great way of phrasing it.
He knows that they're not perfect, and He's saying up front, but I am merciful. And then you see their relationship with these other nations that they try to make treaties, they try to make covenants with, they try to make covenants with other gods. Like, none of it's merciful. It's all brutal, it's all chaos.
Yeah.
It's a disaster. Like, everything is just a disaster. You're reading through Kings, and throughout it, God is continuously merciful over and over and over again. And so he is holding up, going back to that original covenant of saying, like, He is saying, I am merciful from the start, and now He's proving it over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, I mean, it's hard, and when you read Genesis to Malachi, it's hard not to see Exodus 34 through 6 through 7 almost on every page. Because on every page, God is showing His mercy God is showing his grace. God is showing his faithful love. God is showing his forgiveness. And as Kevin just pointed out, like there in Exodus 3, he enters knowing full and well that Israel's probably not going to live up to their bargain.
Well, that's what makes Hosea such a powerful
Yeah.
text is this willingness to go back in face of open rejection and still love them.
Yeah. That is just, Hosea's, I think that's one reason Hosea just kind of resonates with people. Like some of the minor prophets are just hard to understand. They don't connect with us for various reasons. Hosea and Jonah really, I think, connect with us because we see our story and our relationship with God in those pages. We see so many lessons there that are very memorable. Hosea marries a prostitute knowing that this prostitute's going to be unfaithful. Like, there's so many things there that just connect with us in our story, in our relationship with God. And then right in the middle of all of this story, Elisha jumps back on the page. Remember, there's really two big prophets during 1st and 2nd Kings. One's Elijah, one's Elisha. And they have, in many ways, ministries that kind of mimic each other. That's going to be a different series, a different class, a different story for a different time. But Elisha jumps back onto the page here. And this is what I think is just so interesting there in verse 14. Jehoahaz, and this is why I think there was a little bit of syncretism going on, that they were worshiping Yahweh, the one true and living God, alongside these false gods, is because he sees Elijah and he says, my father, the chariots and the horsemen of Israel. Like the king has some semblance of respect for Elisha. And Elisha tells him, get a bow and some arrows. So he got a bow and arrows, and he grasps them, and he says, shoot. There in verse 17. And then Elisha says, in verse 17, shoot. And he shot, and Elisha said, the Lord's arrow of victory, yes, the arrow of victory over Aram. You are to strike the Arameans in Aphek until you have put an end to them. And so Elisha said, take the arrows in verse 18. So Elisha said to the king of Israel, strike the ground. So he struck the ground 3 times and stopped. And Elisha, the man of God, was angry with him and said, you should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. And then you would have struck down Aram until you had put an end to him. But now you will strike down Aram only 3 times. And then Elisha dies. And so what in the world is going on here? Why does the writer of 2 Kings interject this story at this point? Because we've talked about Jehoahaz, and all of a sudden we're talking about Elijah. What's going on? Who was the king of Aram? Look ahead at verse 22. You can also go back a couple of verses. It was mentioned in verse 3 as well. Yeah. Haziel, there we go. Haziel. The southern accent comes out on some of these. So Haziel, who appointed or anointed Haziel as king? Elijah. Remember as Elijah has that episode with God at Mount Carmel, with the prophets of Mount Carmel. Then he goes down to Sinai and he's like, I'm the only one left. And God's like, no, here's a mission for you. And one of the things Elijah was supposed to do was go appoint Haziel as the next king of Aram. And so here you have this guy who is anointed by the prophet of God as the next king of Aram, being announced as judgment on his house through the next prophet. And so Elijah anointed Haziel. Elisha predicted Haziel's ride there in 2 Kings 8. And now Elisha predicts Haziel and Aram's judgment. A judgment that was fulfilled on that battlefield. And I think helped deliver Israel. Because if you go ahead, Haziel of Aram, in verse 22, oppressed Israel throughout the reign of Jehoahaz. But the Lord was, this may sound familiar to us, the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion compassion on them. Do we see those two words close together anywhere else in Scripture? Exodus 34. It's like a little hint about Exodus 34 here. Yeah, Todd, what's going on in your head?
Yeah, not a lot. I believe this is also the king that Naaman served. And when we read that story, the story of Naaman, we kind of will find out that, the Assyrians aren't really all that bad.
Yeah.
They probably have more respect for Yahweh than Israel does.
Yeah. And you see pockets of that, Todd, throughout the Old Testament. Pockets and times in the biblical story where people outside of that covenant, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, have more of an understanding of who God is. And God's own people do. Yeah, Kevin, what's going on there?
I wanted to go back to the arrow thing real
Yeah.
quick too, just because I think that this is symbolically representative of the behavior of Israel throughout. Like, I think at first you're like, oh, cool, the northern king is coming down to visit the prophet of God at his
Yeah.
deathbed.
Yeah.
It's like, that seems like a good sign.
Yeah.
And then, he shoots the arrow, but Elisha tells him to strike the ground. Like, he has a quiver of arrows, he's like, strike the ground, and he strikes it 3 times. And that's kind of the behavior of Israel just throughout. Like, God, they haven't completely rejected God. Like, they still know about him, know he's there, still
Mhm.
worship him a little bit. But when it comes down to do what I ask you to do what the covenant requires of you, it's just a halfway measure.
Yeah.
They strike the ground 3 times, but they don't strike the ground with all of the
Yeah.
whole quiver of arrows. And I think, I think that this is, this incident with him wasn't so much for, it wasn't this trick to give them this opportunity to defeat Syria so many times.
Yeah.
Like, I think God knew that this is the behavior
Yeah.
of them, and he was giving them a chance to kind of act that out
Yeah.
in a way.
They serve God, but not with their whole heart.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't ring a bell sometimes for our life, that we serve God, there are times where we serve God with half our heart, that we, if I can kind of borrow the phraseology here in 2 Kings 13, we strike it 3 instead of 6. We don't go all the way. And that's what you see. I think Kevin brings out a great point there in the text. And so, once again, God shows mercy on Israel. They've sinned. The Lord is gracious. He's compassionate on them. He turned toward them. Now remember, what has Israel been doing for the last, 200 years of their history? The northern kingdom has been turning away from God. They have not been faithful to the covenant. They have not served him with their whole heart. And what is God doing again? He's turning toward them. He's reaching out toward them. He's doing exactly what we saw, mentioned and talked about just briefly a moment ago with Hosea. That he's always reaching out to his people. He wants to have a relationship with them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That he was not willing to destroy them. Think about all they've done. Think about all the sins, all of the unfaithfulness. Think about everything that they have said and done to this point in their history. Serving God with half a heart, serving God alongside false gods. And he's still not willing to destroy them. He's still forgiving. He's still saving them, trying to help them out. Yeah.
And again, I think you make a good point. You mentioned, from our 200 years. I mean, this is not one generation. This is multi-generational. This is across a large span of time. This is going back to the post-revolutionary war up till now, in terms of, and so which is a statement of his patience that we can't even, because we operate in our own generational paradigm.
Yeah.
But the fact is, the Bible, the Old Testament particularly, the New Testament is more truncated, but but the Old Testament spans generation after generation.
Yeah. And that's something that, like, I want us to keep in mind, that we're seeing these characteristics of God not just play out with one generation, but over multi-generation. Like, and this ties into maybe some things we talked about a week or two ago when we looked at the patience of God and how patient God is. They have been ignoring him. They have been turning away from him for 200 years. I'm glad Chris made it relative to us. That's War of 1812. Basically, timeline. From where they are in Israel's history to the moment they started turning away and the kingdom divides. It's basically the War of 1812. 200 years. Turning away and running away from God. By now, almost every one of us would say, okay, I'm done. You've made your bed, lie in it. But God is patient. He forgives, forgives, and forgives. And he even delivers his people when they don't deserve it. So Hazael of Aram died, and his son Ben-Hadad became king in his place there in the text. Any final thoughts and comments before we get to the last question for the day? Thoughts or comments? We'll close on this one. What can we learn about God's character from 2 Kings 13? If you want to widen maybe to all of 2 Kings and what you know, we've answered this in maybe different ways, but let's put more of an application on it for us today. What can we learn about God's character, maybe even how it applies to our life today from these texts?
So if you go back to your second question, I think it was your second question where you asked how did God respond to them in verses 4 and 5?
Yeah.
If you look at how he responded to them in verse 3, he was disciplining them in verse 3. And then when they prayed to him in verse 4 and 5, he relented and showed mercy. So how I see that is he wants them to turn back to him. And so he disciplines when discipline is needed, and he shows mercy when mercy is needed.
I think you're spot on. Like, one of the things I see here, and for those of you who have gone through the parenting journey, and that's several of you, understand this. There are times when your kids don't act right, so you discipline them, but you don't leave them like in the pit forever. Like, your anger burns because they need to be disciplined for whatever they did wrong. But when they do what's right and they come back and they apologize and they're trying to do what's right, what do you do as a parent? You love them and you hug them. We see God in many ways acts the same way, but on a so much greater level than we can fathom. What else do we see here in terms of applications from 2 Kings 13 about God's character?
Like, other than the, like, most overt aspects of, like, it telling us that he's gracious and he's showing them kindness, like, we're seeing that mercy play out. But I think underneath that, and going back to Exodus, that, like, how long this has been, that God is consistent. Like, he does not change. So, like, he made this covenant, he told them that this is his character back in Exodus, and it's still his character. And it's still his character when they sin and they betray him. It's still his character when they're faithful. It's like his character does not change throughout it, and he just keeps doing, like, he keeps being who he is.
He never changes. There's a song that we sang maybe once or twice here. And I know we sang it at some of the song practices, trying to learn new songs. And I'm not going to try to sing it, but it's like Never Stop. I wish I could remember it. I have the tune in my head. Cole, what's the song? It's the new one, Never Stop. oh man, it's a new one. It's never. I'm losing. You were the one who led it. Yeah, it's not Don't Stop Believing,
I went
okay?
straight to Journey.
Okay, I know Journey.
Waymaker?
Yeah, that's it, Waymaker.
Yeah.
What's the chorus?
Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are.
What about the bridge? The
The
never gonna give you up.
all I know is Rick Ashley.
That's Rick Astley.
You never stop. You never stop working.
Never stop. Yeah,
That's all I know.
that's all. That's exactly what I'm thinking of, and I just turned this into a Rickroll. Anyways, one of the things I want to kind of close on to bring us back to the text and my inability to remember a song lyric this morning is that God is a sovereign judge. Yes, that's Todd's topic for next week. But he is also a source of salvation, protection, and forgiveness. That is who our God is. That is who the God of Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, that's who our God is. He hasn't changed. He's still willing to forgive us. I don't think we fully understand the depths of God's love and God's mercy and God's forgiveness at various times in our life. We're going to wrap up there, and I'm going to leave everything else for Todd to wrap up on an edifying note of God's judgment later. But on that note, class dismissed.